The day my neighbor called the police on my legally parked car was the day I finally understood that some people don't want order, they want control. And sometimes the universe has a funny way of making sure those two things don't get confused for very long. My name is Marcus Webb, and for 3 years, I lived what most people would call a quiet life. I worked remotely as a project manager for a logistics firm, which meant my days were structured around early morning calls, spreadsheets, and the occasional walk around the block to clear my head. I owned a modest 2-bedroom home in Sycamore Ridge, a planned community in the kind of suburb that looks perfect on a real estate brochure. Manicured lawns, gas lanterns at every driveway, and a homeowners association that sent monthly newsletters with seasonal color schemes for approved mailbox wreaths. Yes, really. Mailbox wreaths had a color palette, approved annually, by committee. I didn't mind the HOA at first. Rules are rules, and I respected them. I kept my lawn edged, my gutters cleaned, and my recycling bin stored inside the garage by 8 p.m. on collection day. I was, by every reasonable measure, a model neighbor. I smiled at people during morning walks, waved to the Delgados across the street, and made small talk about weather and property values like every other homeowner who had traded spontaneity for square footage. But Sycamore Ridge had a problem. Her name was Diane Colton. Diane was the self-appointed queen of the Sycamore Ridge HOA. Technically, her title was Community Standards Chairperson, a position she had held for 6 consecutive years because nobody else wanted it badly enough to fight her for it. She was in her early 60s, always dressed like she was about to chair a corporate board meeting. Blazers, pressed slacks, hair set like a helmet, and she moved through the neighborhood with the slow, deliberate energy of someone who knew she was being watched and approved of it. She carried a clipboard, not metaphorically, an actual clipboard with a ballpoint pen attached by a spiral cord, like a bank teller from 1987. I had crossed paths with Diane a handful of times in my first year, always civilly. She once left a note on my door about my garden, hose being coiled counterclockwise, which apparently violated no actual rule, but offended her personal aesthetic. I thanked her and coiled it the other way. Easy. Done. What I didn't realize was that my civility had been misread. In Diane Colton's world, compliance wasn't cooperation, it was submission. And submission, to people like Diane, is simply confirmation that they have found the right target. The trouble began on a Tuesday in late October, when I parked my car, a perfectly legal, registered, insured 2019 Ford Explorer, half a foot in front of my own mailbox. Not blocking it, not in anyone's way, half a foot in front of my own property's fixture on the public street, because my brother-in-law was visiting and his truck was in my driveway. I would come to learn, in vivid detail, exactly how that half foot would change everything. It started with a knock, not a friendly knock, the kind of knock that arrives before the other person has fully decided whether they're asking for something or demanding it. 3 sharp raps, pause, 2 more. I set down my coffee and opened the front door to find Diane standing on my porch, clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield, reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, even though she wasn't reading anything. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice carrying the particular warmth of a tax audit. "Diane," I replied. "What can I do for you?" She glanced past me into the house briefly, a habit I had noticed before, as though she were cataloging violations in the background, then returned her eyes to me. "Your vehicle is parked in front of the mailbox access zone. Section 4, Paragraph 7 of the Community Standards clearly states that no vehicle may obstruct mailbox access during postal delivery hours." I stepped outside and looked at my Explorer. It sat maybe 18 inches from the mailbox post, with the rear of the car nowhere near it. The mailman could have parked a small aircraft between my bumper and the box. "That's not obstructing anything," I said, keeping my voice even. "There's plenty of room." Diane's chin tilted upward by precisely the amount required to communicate condescension without technically being rude. "The regulation doesn't require actual obstruction, Mr. Webb. It requires compliance with the clearance standard. I need you to move the vehicle. Diane, it's a public street. It is a community-maintained easement governed by HOA covenant, which you signed when you purchased this property." She tapped the clipboard with one manicured finger. "I've already made note of it. If it isn't moved within the hour, I'll be filing a formal complaint." I looked at her for a moment. There was no anger in her face, which somehow made it worse. Just certainty. The absolute, immovable certainty of someone who had never once been told that they were wrong in a way they actually believed. "Fine," I said. "I'll move it when my brother-in-law leaves." He's been here 20 minutes. The hour begins now, she said, and walked back down my driveway with the measured steps of a judge leaving a courtroom. My brother-in-law, Terrell, had heard the whole thing through the screen door. He came out onto the porch with his arms crossed and one eyebrow raised. "Was that real?" he asked. "Welcome to Sycamore Ridge," I said. That was the first incident. Over the next 3 weeks, Diane Colton filed 4 formal HOA complaints against me. The first was about the car. The second was about a solar-powered pathway light I had installed along my front walkway. Apparently, the warm amber glow was inconsistent with the approved 5000 K white luminary standard described in an addendum I had never received. The third complaint claimed my garbage bins had been visible from the street for more than the allotted 2-hour post-collection window, which I disputed with a time-stamped photo on my phone that she refused to acknowledge. The fourth alleged that a pumpkin, a single, uncarved decorative pumpkin, placed on my front steps in October was a violation of seasonal decor placement boundaries because it sat 14 inches outside the recessed entry threshold. A pumpkin, 14 inches. Each complaint arrived as an official HOA notice, printed on letterhead, with a reference number and a 5-business-day response window. Each one required me to either remedy the issue, submit a written appeal, or face escalating fines that began at $50 and doubled with each cycle. I responded to every single one in writing, calmly and factually, with supporting documentation where I had it. I kept copies of everything in a folder on my kitchen counter that was growing uncomfortably thick. What Diane didn't know, what she couldn't have known because she never thought to ask, was that I had started keeping a log. Dates, times, descriptions, photographs, and audio recordings, all legal under state law, of every interaction I had with her. I wasn't plotting anything. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation. I was simply a project manager by profession, and when something in my environment starts generating unexpected friction, I document it. It's just what I do. The fourth week brought the moment that changed everything. I came home from a grocery run on a Saturday afternoon to find Diane standing beside my parked Explorer. The same car, same spot, same 18-inch clearance from the mailbox, speaking in her phone. She didn't see me pull up because I came in from the other direction and parked on the opposite side of the street to let a cyclist pass. I watched through my windshield as she gestured at my car, spoke firmly into the phone, nodded twice, and then walked calmly back to her own house 3 doors down as though she had just ordered pizza. 35 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled slowly into our cul-de-sac. I was on my porch by then, unloading the last of the groceries. I watched the officer step out, a young man in his late 20s with a patient expression, and walked toward my car. He looked at it, looked at the mailbox, and then looked at me. "Afternoon," he said. "This your vehicle?" "It is," I said. "Is there a problem?" "Got a call about a possible parking violation. Mind if I take a look at your registration?" I went inside and retrieved it without complaint, along with my insurance card. He reviewed both, checked the plates, and then stood beside the car for a moment, measuring the distance to the mailbox with his eyes the way someone does when they already know an answer, but are being professional about confirming it. "You're fine," he said finally, handing the documents back. "There's no violation here. Someone may have been mistaken about the clearance." "Someone wasn't mistaken," I said quietly. He looked at me with the careful neutrality of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had probably seen it before. "Is there anything you'd like to report?" I thought about the folder on my kitchen counter. I thought about 4 complaints, 4 responses, for weeks of being watched and measured and summoned to invisible courts of one-woman judgment. "Not yet," I said, "but I appreciate you asking." He nodded, got back in his cruiser, and left. Diane's front curtain, I noticed, fell back into place. She had been watching the whole time. What Diane Colton did not know, and this is the part where I need you to understand that I did not plan this, I did not arrange it, I simply had the extraordinary luck of a man who had been keeping very good records, was that 2 days before she called the police on my car, I had filed a formal complaint of my own. Not with the HOA, with the county. 6 weeks earlier, while responding to Diane's second formal complaint and researching the HOA covenant she kept citing, I had gone to the county assessor's office to pull the original recorded plat for Sycamore Ridge. What I found there, buried in a 2009 amendment to the community's founding documents, was something that made me sit very still in a plastic chair in a government office for about 4 minutes before I fully processed it. The HOA, specifically its Standard Enforcement Committee, was legally required under state nonprofit governance law to hold open noticed quarterly meetings where community members could observe and contest enforcement actions. Diane had been chairing closed enforcement sessions, just herself, sometimes with one other board member, for at least 2 years, according to the meeting minutes I requested under the state's Nonprofit Records Access statute. No public notices had been posted. No community members had been invited. The complaints she had been filing, the fines she had been levying, the enforcement action she had been taking, none of them had gone through the legally required process. Every fine she had issued in the past 2 years was potentially void. I filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's Nonprofit Oversight Division. I also, on the advice of a neighbor who happened to be a retired real estate attorney named Harold Finch, who had been watching Diane for years and had his own folder, considerably thicker than mine, filed a secondary complaint with the county regarding the HOA's unlicensed use of a community fund that Diane had established to beautify common areas, which had received over $14,000 in assessed fees from residents with no public accounting of how the money had been spent. That was 2 days before she called the police on my car. The Saturday after the officer left, I was sitting at my kitchen table going through emails when I saw Harold's name on my phone screen. I answered immediately. "Marcus," he said, and I could hear something in his voice I hadn't heard before, a kind of barely contained satisfaction, like a man setting down a weight he had carried for a long time. "They moved fast. I didn't expect it this soon. They're coming Tuesday." "Who's coming?" I asked. "The AG's office sent investigators. They're also bringing someone from the county DA's financial crimes unit." "The fund issue, Marcus. The $14,000. I sat very still. "Harold, are you serious?" "I have the letter right here," he said. "They want to interview residents. They're going to need your documentation." I looked at my folder. Then I looked at the one next to it, the one I had started compiling after the first complaint, the one with the HOA ledger pages Harold had helped me obtain, the one with the bank statements showing that the beautification fund had made 3 transfers to a personal account registered to Diane Colton's married name. "I'll have everything ready," I said. Tuesday arrived gray and cool, the kind of morning that feels deliberate. 2 vehicles parked in front of the community's shared mailbox kiosk at the entrance of the cul-de-sac, a plain sedan and a dark SUV. 4 people got out. 2 wore suits. 2 wore badges and uniforms. They walked directly to Diane Colton's front door. I was at my living room window. I'm not ashamed of that. I watched Diane answer the door in her blazer, clipboard in hand, even at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I watched her face perform a sequence of expressions that I will never fully forget as long as I live. First, the practiced authority of a woman who assumed she knew why officials appeared at doors. Then, the micro-hesitation of someone reading a credential that doesn't match their assumption. Then, the slow, terrible realization spreading from her eyes down to her jaw like ice water finding cracks in concrete. I stepped outside when I heard her voice rise. "This is completely inappropriate," she was saying, her words sharp but her pitch climbing in a way that betrayed them. "I don't know what you've been told, but I have managed this community's standards for 6 years, and I have documentation for everything." "Ma'am," one of the suited investigators said, with the calm authority of a man who has had this conversation before and has never lost it, "we have documentation too. We'd like you to come with us to answer some questions regarding the administration of the Sycamore Ridge Community Enhancement Fund. You're not under arrest at this time. You may choose to have an attorney present." "I don't need an attorney," Diane snapped. "I haven't done anything wrong." Harold had come out onto his own porch by then. So had the Delgados. So had 3 other neighbors whose names I'm still learning. We stood a loose constellation of people who had all, in our own ways and for our own reasons, been on the wrong end of Diane's clipboard. What happened next took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like a film reel playing in slow motion. The investigators went inside with Diane. One of the uniformed officers stayed by the door. Another walked to Diane's car in the driveway and began photographing the registration sticker and license plate, a detail that seemed small but carried enormous weight when I later learned it was related to a vehicle registered to the HOA that Diane had been using for personal purposes, funded by the same account under investigation. When Diane came back out, she was not in handcuffs yet. She was walking, speaking in clipped, indignant sentences, her clipboard now gone. Left inside, or taken, I couldn't be sure. But as she reached the driveway, and one of the officers stepped forward and said something low and quiet that I couldn't hear from where I stood, she stopped walking. The color left her face. I watched it go. The officer spoke again, and this time I heard enough. At this time, I am placing you under arrest for misappropriation of funds. The handcuffs came out, and Diane Colton, community standard chairperson, wielder of the clipboard, color palette enforcer of seasonal mailbox wreaths, stood on her own driveway and was read her rights in front of the neighborhood she had lorded over for 6 years. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood very straight and stared a point somewhere above the roofline of my house, as though if she didn't look at us, we weren't there. But we were, all of us, silent and watching. The arrest was processed that Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, it was a matter of public record, which meant it was also, inevitably, a matter of neighborhood conversation. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because I think honesty is the only thing that gives a story like this its proper weight. There was no celebration. Not for me, at least. I stood in my kitchen Wednesday morning with my folder of documentation spread across the table. 4 weeks of complaints, photographs, HOA covenant amendments, ledger printouts, and a timeline I had typed up the night before Harold's request, and I felt something much quieter than victory. I felt tired. The specific exhaustion of a person who spent weeks being told they were wrong about something they knew they were right about, and who now had to sit with the aftermath of being proven correct. The neighborhood, however, had its own processing to do. By Thursday, there were 3 different group texts I had been added to. I didn't even know half these people had my number, full of people sharing their own stories about Diane. Fines they had paid that they now suspected were invalid. Warnings they had received that had no basis in the actual HOA documents. One woman, a nurse named Priya who lived on the far side of the cul-de-sac, told me she had paid $250 in fines over 18 months for a wind chime. A wind chime that Diane had classified as a sound disturbance fixture under a section of the community standards that, when Priya finally looked it up herself, said nothing of the sort. Harold filed a class action notice on behalf of affected residents within the week. I don't know the full legal outcome yet, as these things move slowly, but the HOA's board, which had been functionally dormant while Diane ran everything herself, convened an emergency session and voted to freeze all enforcement actions pending a complete audit of the past 3 years of records. Every fine issued during Diane's closed enforcement sessions was placed under review. Mine were among the first to be formally voided. The letter arrived on a Friday, printed on the same HOA letterhead I had come to dread. But this one was signed by a new interim chairperson, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Alan who had called me the previous week to apologize personally, which I had not expected and which had genuinely moved me. And it stated, in careful formal language, that all 4 complaints filed against my property had been reviewed, found to be procedurally deficient, and were hereby rescinded with no record retained in my file. I read it twice. Then I put it in the folder, which I moved from the kitchen counter to a drawer in my office. I didn't throw it away. I'm not sure I ever will. Not out of bitterness. I want to be clear about that. But because I think there is value in remembering how close a person can come to simply being worn down into compliance. How many letters I almost didn't answer. How many times I considered just paying the fines to make the harassment stop. Because fighting back is exhausting, and the cost of a $50 fine is sometimes less than the cost of your own peace of mind. I didn't give in, and I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it matters. Diane's legal situation moved forward through the fall. The DA's office confirmed charges related to misappropriation of nonprofit funds. The $14,000 in the beautification account had indeed been partially redirected, used for personal home improvement expenses that Diane had apparently believed would go unnoticed in a community where she controlled the records. She resigned from the HOA board the same day she was charged, which was the only decision she made throughout this entire situation that I considered genuinely wise. I heard, through Harold, that she had retained an attorney and was cooperating with investigators. I heard, through the neighborhood grapevine, that she had put her house on the market. I don't know what her life looks like now on the other side of what happened. I'm not sure it's my place to know. What I do know is this. The week after the arrest, I came outside one morning to find my Pathway solar light, the amber one, the one that violated the 5000 K white luminary standard, glowing softly in the early gray light. I stood there for a minute just looking at it. It was warm and quiet and entirely, defiantly itself. And I thought about how strange it is that we build communities and then spend so much energy policing the small, personal ways people try to make a place feel like home. A light, a pumpkin, a car parked 18 inches from a mailbox. Terrell came to visit again the following month, and his truck was back in my driveway. My Explorer was parked in the same spot as before, same street, same clearance, same 18 inches from the mailbox post. I didn't think about it until he pointed it out over dinner. "Isn't that where all this started?" he asked. I glanced out the window at the car, sitting quiet and ordinary in the last light of the afternoon. "Yeah," I said, "it is." He shook his head slowly. "All of that? Over a parking spot?" "Not really," I said after a moment. It was never about the parking spot. It was about whether she could make me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. Whether she could make the rules small enough and frequent enough and exhausting enough that I'd eventually just stop pushing back. Terrell was quiet for a second, and I picked up my coffee, and I kept every receipt. There is something I want to say to anyone reading this who has been there, who has felt the low-grade, daily weight of someone in a position of minor authority deciding that you are the problem, who has received the letters, paid the fines, bitten their tongue, and wondered whether fighting back is worth the energy it costs. It is. Not because the universe always delivers justice on a Tuesday morning in the form of a dark sedan and a pair of handcuffs. Sometimes it doesn't. But because the act of documenting, of staying calm, of refusing to be worn down into believing that the harassment is deserved, that act has a value that goes beyond any specific outcome. It is the act of insisting that you are who you know yourself to be, even when someone with a clipboard is working very hard to convince you otherwise. My amber light is still glowing. My pumpkin goes out every October. And for the first time in a long time, my neighborhood feels like a place where people actually live, imperfect and warm and fully, unapologetically themselves.